The dust storm came like a monster unchained, swallowing the horizon in a wall of choking gray. It howled across the plains with a voice that sounded less like wind and more like a wounded beast dragging itself over the dying land. To Eloise McCarty, it was one more reminder that the land she clung to was no longer hers, not truly. Her husband had been claimed by a storm just like this one, leaving her to fight against the elements and against the silence of a home too large for a single soul. She stood on the sagging porch of her farmhouse, her skirts whipping in the gale, her shawl clutched so tightly to her shoulders it seemed sewn to her flesh. She should have gone inside, barred the door, and prayed the walls held. But through the roar of the storm came a sound stranger than the wind itself, a human voice, faint but desperate. Then came shapes, half swallowed by the storm. Three figures stumbled out of the gray, scarves pulled over their faces, hats bent low against the assault of dust. Cowboys, strangers, beaten nearly to their knees by the storm. Eloise's first thought was fear, and knock on the door at sundown rarely brought good in a land this wild. Yet these men didn't move like raiders. They moved like men on the edge of ruin. His face etched by dust and desperation. Ma'am, he croaked, tipping his hat with a hand that shook. We ain't looking for trouble, just shelter, if you'd allow it. Eloise hesitated, her hand twitching toward the shotgun by her door. Instinct screamed caution. A woman alone could not afford kindness, but when she looked into their faces, she didn't see danger. She saw men unraveling, the storm gnawing at them like wolves at a carcass. With a small, reluctant nod, she opened her door. Inside, the men removed their hats with a slow reverence, as though afraid to stain her small, tired home with their brokenness. Eloise moved to the kitchen, her hands trembling but certain. A bit of cornmeal, a scrap of bacon fat. She scraped together what little remained, a rough skillet of cornbread, and the weakest coffee she could brew. The men murmured their thanks, weary gratitude, heavy in their voices. All but one. He stood apart, silent as a stone, a scar cutting across his face like a mark from another life. His pale eyes never wavered from her, not unkind, but unreadable, as though weighing her against some measure only he understood. When she set the food on the table, the two talkative ones dug in like men who hadn't eaten in days. The scarred man waited until she gave the slightest nod before he touched the bread, breaking it with slow, methodical care. They ate mostly in silence, save for the storm clawing at the windows. Later, as the others collapsed near the hearth, the silent one remained standing, staring into the flames. Eloise offered him a worn blanket. He didn't speak, only tilted his head in acknowledgement. But when she turned away, she heard the rustle of cloth lifted with surprising gentleness. That night, Eloise lay awake in her narrow bed, the wind shrieking against the walls. She had given shelter to men she didn't know, men she could not afford to feed. And deep in her bones, she knew this night was not the end of it. Something had shifted. She just didn't know if it was salvation or ruin. Morning came blood red and heavy. The storm had passed, leaving behind drifts of dust, broken fences, and a silence so deep it pressed on her chest. Two of the men were gone, their bedrolls folded neatly, a small stack of coins left behind as thanks. Only one remained, the scarred man. He stood by the window, broad frame outlined in gray light, his hand flexing at his side as if waiting for a blow. Eloise cleared her throat. Coffee's cold, she said softly, but you're welcome to it. He turned, nodding once. His voice, rough as gravel, rumbled low when she asked his name. Calder, he said. Just that. No surname, no history. A name that sounded like storms rolling in across the plains. Through the day, he helped without asking, hauling water, mending fences, repairing what the storm had tried to claim. He spoke little, yet his presence was steady, unintrusive, like a stone set against the river of loneliness, threatening to sweep her away. That night, by the weak glow of the hearth, Eloise found herself telling him what she hadn't spoken aloud in years, about her husband, about the whispers of the town that blamed her for living when he had not. Calder listened without judgment. When he finally spoke, his words were plain, rough, but they struck like balm. You ain't foolish. You're standing. That's more than most. For Eloise, it was the first kindness she had felt in years. But kindness, she knew, was dangerous. Out here, it could turn as quickly as the wind. And as she lay in her bed that night, staring at the ceiling while the fire died, she felt something stirring where grief had made its home. Something dangerously close to hope. But hope in a land like this came at a cost. And when Calder finally saddled his horse and disappeared into the dust the next morning, Eloise thought the price was silence once again. She did not know that by sundown the horizon would tremble, not with a storm, but with riders. The next day passed like an ache that refused to ease. Eloise tended to her farm with slow mechanical care, her thoughts circling the empty chair across her table, the quiet absence of the man called Calder. She told herself it was better this way. Men passed through like storms, brief, violent, and gone. Yet by nightfall, when the loneliness pressed hardest, a sound shattered the stillness, a low, steady rumble. Not the storm returning, but something heavier. Hooves, heart hammering. Eloise rushed to the porch. At first she saw only dust lifting at the horizon. Then came shapes, dark against the dying light. Riders, dozens of them. For a moment, terror clawed at her. A raiding party. Trouble brought to her door. But as they drew closer, the truth unfolded. These were no marauders. They were men carrying supplies. Grain, lumber, barrels of water. And at their head rode Calder. He didn't smile. He didn't speak. He simply dismounted, set a sack of flour at her feet, and nodded once. Storm took from you, he said. We aim to give back. The riders moved with quiet purpose, repairing fences, patching roofs, reinforcing the barn. They worked as if bound to her by an oath, as if her single act of kindness had tied invisible threads between them. Eloise carried water, cooked what she could, her heart torn between gratitude and disbelief. For years she had lived with nothing but whispers and blame. Now her land swarmed with life, with men who expected nothing in return but the chance to repay a debt she had never asked them to hold. Even then, shadows lingered at the edge of her vision, curtains twitching in distant farmhouses, shapes lingering on the ridges. The town was watching, judging, their whispers sharp as knives. A widow alone was expected to suffer quietly, not invite a small army of strangers into her home. Eloise knew the whispers would grow louder, but for the first time in years, She felt strong enough to face them. That night, as stars blazed across the sky, Calder stood before her on the porch. "You saved us," he said, his voice low, carrying the weight of men long forgotten. "Decent folks turned us away before. You didn't." Eloise shook her head, her voice breaking. "I only did what anyone decent would do." Calder's gaze held hers, steady, unflinching. "No, ma'am. Decent folks turned us away before." The words settled like iron in the air. If you've felt the weight of this story, if you've been gripped by the silence of storms and the fragile flame of hope, take a moment to subscribe. Here, we tell the stories, history almost buried, the dark, the haunted, the forgotten, stories that deserve to be heard. Days passed, the farm transformed under calloused hands and quiet determination. Yet Eloise could not ignore the question gnawing at her. Why had Calder returned? He offered no promises, no explanations. He worked. He stayed. He watched with eyes that saw more than she dared admit. And though he never crossed the fragile line between them, something deeper rooted itself in the silence they shared. But kindness, like storms, never comes without cost. One evening, as the last nails were driven into the repaired barn, Eloise stood with Calder under the weight of the stars. "Don't expect the town to take kindly to this," she whispered. "They've never forgiven me for surviving." Calder's scarred face softened with something like recognition. "Then let 'em watch," he said. His voice was a low rumble, the sound of a man who had lived too long with blame. For the first time, Eloise felt the sting of her solitude, ease, not erased, not forgotten, but shared. And when she looked at the line of riders camped on her land, men who had arrived as shadows and stayed as a shield, she realized the truth. A storm had taken her husband, but another storm had given her something else, something just as dangerous, just as fragile, a chance to stand without fear. The dust still clung to the land, the horizon still bled gray, but in the hollow silence of the plains, Eloise heard something new, not the howl of despair, not the groan of loss, but the sound of hammers, of laughter, of men refusing to let the storm write the final word. In that moment, she understood. Some storms take everything, but others, if you survive them, leave behind the beginnings of a new world. And as you sit with this story, ask yourself, if a stranger came to your door in the storm, would you open it?